Our multi-generational story today is Ki Punamuk, Boyachum's Thanksgiving story, written by Danielle Greendeer, Anthony Perry, and Alexis Bunton, illustrated by Gary Meaches Sr. This story imagines how the Wampanoag people might tell the story of how they and the Pilgrims celebrated their first harvest together. The narrator is not identified, unfortunately.
Kipunamuk, Weochamam's Thanksgiving Story, written by Danielle Greendeer, Anthony Perry, and Alexis Bunton, illustrated by Gary Meaches Sr. I love your garden this time of year, said Maple. Me too. What shall we pick for lunch? Newcomus asked. How about crab apples? Maple suggested. No, choke cherries, Quill shouted. Those are both good medicine, Newcomus said. How about some weochamam as well? Yes, Maple replied. She is such a good big sister to beans and squash. The three sisters, they grow together, Quill added. You're right. They feed people all over Turtle Island, Newcomus said, and they have many stories to tell. Can you tell us a story? Quill asked. How about the time Weochamam asked our Wampanoag ancestors to help the Pilgrims? Newcomus replied. The first Thanksgiving? Maple asked. Some people call it that, Newcomus said. We call it Kipunamuk, the time of harvest. Here's what really happened. One frosty fall morning, a long time ago, a large boat with white sails approached the shore. Seagulls circled above the boat, squawking. New people are coming! New people are coming! Hearing the news, Weochamam stretched her wary ears towards the sky. Who are these new people? She asked. 2 winters had passed since many of the first peoples who cared for Weochamam passed on to the spirit world. Those who were not taken by sickness found new homes to ease their heavy hearts and rebuild their lives. Weochamam feared this winter would be her last and called upon Fox for help. Fox looked up at Weochamam. Should we trust these newcomers? He asked. Stay close and watch what they do, Weochamam told Fox. Fall turned to winter. Weochamam and other plants fell asleep. Fox watched the newcomers come ashore. He watched as they made their way into the forest. He watched them enter an abandoned wetu. He watched them take a cooking pot and a basket of Weochamam's seeds. Don't take us away, the seeds cried. We are waiting for the first peoples to come back in the spring to prepare our beds. We must grow first. But the newcomers could not hear the seeds. Their ears did not know the voices of the land. Fox watched the newcomers build homes on top of an empty village. He watched as they searched for food, but they could never find enough to eat. Many of the newcomers lost mothers, fathers, brothers, and sisters during the long cold winter. The first peoples watched as well. News traveled fast among nearby tribes that newcomers had arrived. Nobody was sure what to make of them. For many years, others had traveled across the sea to hunt, fish, and trade. Some were friendly, and some were not. These new people seemed different. They were here to stay. Winter turned into spring. The sun warmed the earth. The newcomers continued their search for food. Weochamam awoke from her long slumber and thanked the Creator for another season. She and her sisters, Beans and Squash, pushed through the ground and reached toward the sky. Fox returned to share what he had seen. The newcomers are hungry, Fox told the 3 sisters. They took Weochamam's seeds, but they don't know how to help them grow. Other animals came to hear what Fox had to say. We should help, Weachaman said. I agree, Bean said. Our home is their home now. I think we should too, said Squash. People help us grow. We must help, Deer said. We agreed to feed the people. In return, they care for the home we share. I wouldn't, said Fox. The newcomers don't know our world. Sometimes new people can seem scary, Rabbit said. The Creator tells us to help all living things. This is how the world works. Yes, Duck and Turkey agreed. It's settled, said Weachaman. We will send the first peoples to help the newcomers. Over the next few nights, Weachaman sent dreams to the first peoples with the message. Bring me and my sisters to the newcomers. They are hungry and need help. The first peoples listened. Their leader, Usamikwan, visited the newcomers. He could see that they wanted peace. Usamikwan introduced the newcomers to Tisquantum. Spring turned into summer. Tisquantum showed the newcomers how to raise Weachaman and her sisters, Beans and Squash. He taught the newcomers how to feed fish and seaweed to Weachaman to help her grow. Soon, Weachaman's seeds pushed through the earth and climbed toward the sky. Beans wrapped around Weachaman's strong stalks. Squash stretched her vines across the ground, keeping Weachaman's bed cool and moist. Summer turned to fall. Weachaman brimmed with food. So did Beans and Squash. Weachaman smiled as the newcomers thanked Tisquantum and the first peoples for their help. Kipanamuk, the time of harvest had come. The newcomers prepared a feast to celebrate the first year in their new home. They fired muskets in celebration. Boom, boom, boom! Usamikwan, warriors, and other first peoples arrived. They feasted for 3 days. That meal changed both our lives and theirs forever. Many Americans call it a day of Thanksgiving. Many of our people call it a day of mourning. That's different from what we learned in school, said Maple. It was Weachaman and the other beings of the land, sea, and sky who made the newcomers' first harvest possible? That's right, Newcomer said. This is why we pray before we eat. Well, what did the newcomers and our ancestors eat, Newcomers? Quill asked. Many things. Succotash, duck, turkey, rabbit, deer, lobster, fish, pumpkins, cranberries, boiled bread, and nasam, Newcomer said. All this talk about food is making me hungry, Maple said. Let's go make us some lunch then, Newcomer laughed. And we'll enjoy every bite, said Quill. About the Wampanoag tribes. The Mashpee Wampanoag people live in the Cape Cod area of Massachusetts and call themselves the people of the first light. There were 69 Wampanoag tribes living in southeast
We arrive today, as we do every week, with both joys and sorrows. In our multi-generational story, Nokomis observes that many Wampanoag now view Thanksgiving as a day of mourning. Most, if not all of us, were not raised with that perspective. In school, we learned the sweet story of how the Wampanoag saved the Pilgrims from starvation. We were told that they all celebrated together in friendship. And the next we hear, bloody warfare has erupted among the original peoples and European settlers, and it continues to occur until the 1870s. Those stories are generally presented as peaceful white settlers being victims of unprovoked violence by whichever of our original nations they were encountering. The Unitarian side of our Unitarian Universalist family traces our theological ancestry directly to the Pilgrims. Our Congregationalist cousins who form the United Church of Christ do as well. So the Thanksgiving story and its aftermath is our story. November is also Native American Heritage Month, and the day after Thanksgiving is Native American Heritage Day. What better time to talk about repairing societal wrongs as they pertain to our original nations and people than today? As Unitarian Universalists, we are called to repair societal harms. Merging Waters, as a member congregation of the Unitarian Universalist Association, is committed to a covenant that states in part, love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. Further, this congregation has committed itself to courageous love as one of its shared values. If we are to live our faith and not just talk about it, we must engage in actions of reparation, of societal repair. Discussions about reparations usually focus on money. We see reparations as similar to monetary damages paid in a civil lawsuit. However, there is more to reparations than simply paying money to groups that have been harmed. The Movement for Black Lives says, reparations include 5 key components: cessation or assurance of non-repetition, restitution and repatriation, compensation, satisfaction, and rehabilitation. Reparations are a concept rooted in international law that involves specific forms of repair to specific individuals, groups of people, or nations for specific harms they have experienced in violation of their human rights. Therefore, reparations cannot be achieved simply through an acknowledgement or an apology or investment in underprivileged communities. My framework for considering societal healing is drawn from Zanya Rutenberg's book on repentance and repair, making amends in an unapologetic world. Rutenberg uses the work of 12th century Rabbi Joseph ben Maimon, commonly known as Maimonides. There are 5 parts to Maimonides' process of repair. 1, naming and owning the harm. 2, starting to change. 3, restitution and accepting consequences. 4, apology. 5, making different choices. I'll provide examples of each step in Maimonides' process and end with a reflection on how love, courageous, liberating love, can guide our own actions toward repairing societal harm. I'll also be using the phrase original nations and people. The label Native American is felt by some as misidentification. American is a colonizer label. So too is indigenous. Best practice is to use the person's specific national identity where it is known, and where it's not known, I'll continue to use original nations and people. So step 1, name and own the harm. Maimonides' first step is naming and owning the harm. To name a few examples of harm to our original peoples, the population of original peoples was decimated by war and lack of resistance to diseases brought by European settlers. Every treaty between the U.S. government and original nations has been broken, ignored, or modified in ways not favorable to the original peoples. Here in Minnesota, when the Dakota complained of late annuity payments and starvation in 1862, Anglo-trader Andrew Myrick at the Lower Sioux Agency wrote to another land agent saying, "Let them eat grass or their own dung." And that comment was what precipitated the so-called Dakota-U.S. War. Original peoples were also victims of fraud and in some cases murder when mineral or oil rights were discovered. Promised reservation lands were significantly reduced. White settlers encroached on reservation lands without consequences. Federal aid was never sufficient to provide a quality of life comparable to the white population. The legacy of colonialism is reflected in shorter lifespans, poverty, higher rates of incarceration, and substance abuse among our original peoples. From 1819 to 1969, as many as 18,624 children, some as young as 4, were taken from their parents and placed into one of 523 residential schools. The explicitly stated object of these schools was, quote, kill the Indian, save the man. Even though most of the children spoke no English when they arrived, they were severely punished for speaking their native language, forbidden to wear traditional dress, or to practice their traditional religious beliefs. They were subjected to poor food, clothing, housing, and physical and sexual abuse. Official tallies show that 973 children died in such schools. Other estimates are that over 4,000 children died. Unitarians are complicit in some of these harms. Unitarian ministers operated 2 schools in Colorado for the Utes and 1 in Montana. Our residential schools lasted only a few years. The minutes of meetings among Unitarian ministers in Boston during that time period note that funding was a problem. And while there is no information about the children's experience there in our schools, if funding was a problem, it is safe to guess that the conditions for the children were not good. These Unitarians were not racist in the sense of believing that the Utes were inferior to whites, but they did feel that assimilating them into white culture was a good and necessary thing. In 2019, UUA President Reverend Bill Sinkford issued an apology in person to a representative of the Ute Nation at our General Assembly, which was held in Salt Lake City that year. You might also note that when I talked about the Ute school being in Colorado, the Utes originally were not in Utah, they were in Colorado, but they were driven out as part of an effort to exterminate them. To their credit, the Unitarian ministers who were working with them did write to the War Office to say that they felt that the Utes were not warlike, they were not going to engage in attacks on white people, but that did not matter when westward expansion was the goal. The problems experienced by our original people are the results of centuries of conscious attempts to exterminate them by warfare, destroy their culture and religious practices, or to starve them into submission, such as in the deliberate destruction of the American bison. Whether or not our ancestors participated in any of these activities, all of us who are descended from immigrants benefit from them. All of us who descend from European immigrants have benefited from centuries of genocide, land theft, and other forms of harm against our original nations and peoples. As a group, we would not have the wealth we have absent such harm. The second step in Maimonides' process is starting to change. In order to begin the process of repair, we need to commit to change the harmful behavior. We can't, as a society, begin to repair harm if we continue to inflict harm. The legal framework for white domination over original nations and people began in 1452 with a papal bull that authorized Christians, meaning white Europeans, to take possessions of the lands of non-Christians in the interest of saving their souls and to kill or even enslave them if it turned out they didn't want to be saved. Non-Christians were not recognized as legitimate landowners, and any lands discovered by Christian explorers were claimed as property of the discoverer's nation. Even after many original peoples became Christian, the doctrine of discovery still applied. In 1823, the U.S. Supreme Court, ruling in Johnson v. McIntosh, held that the U.S. inherited the doctrine of discovery, and it has served as the basis of U.S. law ever since. In 2005, in the Sherrill v. Oneida case, the U.S. Supreme Court reaffirmed unanimously the McIntosh decision. That decision, which was written by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, was unanimous. In some respects, there has been change. The federal government is no longer sending the cavalry to slaughter people. On the other hand, in 2016, violence was used against unarmed, peaceful protesters at Standing Rock. This time it was not the cavalry, but sheriff's deputies from the upper Midwest, including staff from the Anoka, Hennepin, and Washington County sheriff's offices. In 2021, law enforcement was used against unarmed people protesting Line 3 here in Minnesota. In both cases, protesters identified as original peoples were more likely to be arrested, charged with more serious crimes, and receiving longer sentences than white protesters. While we have discontinued the boarding schools, schools on the reservation were underfunded. Having done the work to understand the problem and to change our behavior, we are now ready for step 3, restitution and accepting consequences. An important point for Maimonides is that restitution needs to be acceptable to the injured party. We don't get to make reparations in a way that satisfies us. Reparations must ultimately satisfy our original nations and people. The U.S. government has engaged in limited restitution for our original peoples. After World War II, the Indian Claims Commission paid a total of $1.3 billion in reparations to Native Americans. Sounds like a lot of money. However, this amount provided only $1,000 per individual and offered little overall benefit. In 1980, the Supreme Court ordered the United States to pay the Sioux Nation over $105 million for the illegal government seizure of their land. But many Native American leaders called for the return of the sacred land, not financial compensation. The money, which sits in a trust and has grown to more than $1 billion, remains unclaimed. For the Lakota, Pahasapa, the Black Hills, is sacred. In their origin story, Pahasapa is the place from which the Lakota emerged. It cannot be replaced with money. The refusal of the Sioux to accept the money clearly shows that this attempt at restitution was unacceptable. In 2023, after an 18-year-long fight, the Upper Sioux Agency State Park here in Minnesota was given back to the Dakota. The land comprising the state park had included traditional grave sites and is considered sacred by the Dakota. Understandably, the Dakota were outraged that they needed to pay state park fees in order to visit the graves of their ancestors. Lower Sioux Agency President Robert Larson said, "Our ancestors paid for this land over and over with their lives. It's been paid for by the ones that aren't here anymore." For meaningful reparations to be made, those who caused the harm need to listen deeply and carefully to the people who have been harmed. These kinds of conversations cannot occur without relationships, without trust. The harms done to our original nations and peoples happened over many generations, and it may well take generations for relationships to be built. Apology. It is interesting that Maimonides does not recommend attempting to apologize until some serious work is done. An apology not based on an understanding of or acceptance of responsibility for inflicting harm, making changes in behavior, and offering restitution is likely to be shallow, and the harm is likely to persist. Unfortunately, neither the U.S. government nor most of its citizens has done this important work. Formal apologies have been issued to original nations and peoples. In 2010, the U.S. Congress adopted resolutions acknowledging, quote, "a long history of official depredations and ill-conceived policies by the federal government regarding Indian tribes," and offered an apology to all Native peoples on behalf of the people of the United States. While offering an apology with one hand, Congress took it back with the other. The resolution expressly states that nothing in it authorizes or supports any legal claims against the United States, and the resolution does not settle any claims. The resolution was signed by President Obama without much fanfare. Guy Capriccioso of the American Indian Law Research Center justly asks, is an apology that's not said out loud really an apology? What if the person expressing the apology doesn't draw attention to it? Maimonides would agree. Public harm requires a public apology. On October 26, a little over a month ago, President Biden issued a very public and well-reported on apology for the U.S. boarding schools. He noted the harm done to children, to families. He apologized for the lives lost. In issuing the apology, Biden said, It's long, long, long overdue. Quite frankly, there's no excuse that this apology took 50 years to make, 50 years being the time since the last of the boarding schools was closed. The federal Indian boarding school policy and the pain it has cost will always be a significant mark of shame, a blot on American history. While darkness can hide much, it erases nothing. Some injustices are heinous, horrific, and grievous. They can't be buried no matter how hard people try. While Biden's apology was regarded as a good first step, many original nations and people consider it incomplete. Native American Rights Fund Executive Director John Echohawk notes that the U.S. Army continues to refuse to fulfill requests for repatriation of the remains of the children who died at one of the first and most notorious federal Indian boarding schools, the Carlisle Industrial School. A critical point that Maimonides makes is that the injured party has no obligation to accept our apology. It may be that our original people will never grant forgiveness for the harms they suffered, no matter what we say or what is offered by way of reparation. Their refusal to accept the apology, let alone grant forgiveness, does not make them the bad guys and us the good guys. If our offer of apology is not accepted, that does not mean we can forgo making repair. We white citizens of the U.S. may have to accept that as a consequence of our collective history is that we are never fully forgiven for our wrongdoing. The final piece of Maimonides' process for making repair is to make different choices. For the U.S., this would mean fully funding all the services promised to our original nations and people. It would mean deep conversations with the many original nations to determine what they would consider to be appropriate reparations. With hundreds of recognized tribes, one size will not fit all. It would mean telling the whole truth about our national history, not just the whitewashed version most of us learned in school. Sadly, our recent election has resulted in the election of people who most certainly are opposed to doing the hard work of healing the wounds settler colonialism has inflicted on our original nations and people. One way of repairing harm is for us as individuals to use our voices and our votes to oppose attempts to keep our students from learning the bad as well as the good about U.S. history. We white Americans need to accept that our history has an unsavory side. In this faith community, we can learn the truth and tell the truth about U.S. history. Our book clubs can choose books that address these issues. We can engage with other groups working to address our historic harms. Although the Thanksgiving holiday moved me to focus on the harms inflicted on our original nations and people, Maimonides' principles would apply to any instances of systemic harm. As we know, Black people, our GLBTQAI population, disabled people, and women have and continue to be subject to systemic oppression. Each of us as individuals may be moved by different issues. We, as a congregation, need to engage in deep discernment as we decide where we wish to focus our efforts. Our opening hymn suggests we consider the way we spend, the way we share. We can choose to spend our money by patronizing original people's own businesses. We can share our resources by donating to organizations led by members of our original nations and people. This congregation, for example, has been making an annual donation for the International Institute for Transformative Collaboration. This is an indigenous-led effort that seeks to bring white people and original peoples together to talk about how we can relate to one another as human beings and how we can relate to our planet. Quoting Danya Ruttenberg again, "The work of repentance all the way through is the work of transformation. It's the work of facing down false stories and engaging in painful reality. It's the work of being open to seeing ourselves as we really are. It's about figuring out how to be the kind of person who sees others suffering and takes responsibility for any role we might have in causing it. The work of repairing societal wrongs is hard work. It is even harder to look honestly at the harm we participate in and make a commitment to changing our behaviors. We are called to do this work by our associations and by our congregation's shared value of love. The spiritual discipline of love is why we start this work and why we continue this work, even when it is difficult, even when it requires us to make sacrifices. Love gives us the courage to reach out, to keep trying. Australian blogger Lila Madeline puts it this way: I love you, as in, I will fight unendingly for a world in which you are free. Our closing hymn calls us to change the world with our love. May we have the courage to, quote, love the hell out of the world, as our Universalist forebears would say. May our love for the oppressed and marginalized call us to do the work and to hold ourselves accountable for doing the work. May we make it so.